Okay, so I suppose at the outset, what I'm going to invite people to do if they have any questions or comments or issues they'd like to discuss. Are there any? Here we are, up the back there.
Is it your feeling that the discretions for the councils have increased or decreased under the proposed new legislation? And assuming whatever the answer to that might be, will it depend to a large extent on the political nature of the council in any particular area? I'll answer this one because I've got the microphone, and then we might see if anyone disagrees. I think it's quite clear that the extent of discretion available both to the council and to the tribunal has decreased significantly. It is clearly a prime objective and an express objective of these new zones to introduce what is perhaps optimistically described as planning certainty. And that's done by saying, for example, having mandatory height limits that you cannot exceed. So we're moving back from a position where the height of a building was determined by its individual context and by how good a building it was, and whether it was 4 or 5 stories wasn't important as how well it worked as a building, to a situation where even in the most progressive residential growth zone, unless you go out of your way to specify a height of in excess of 13.5 metres, that's all you get. You cannot go higher, even if you get the best architect in the world to design you a 5-storey building. So there's a clear reduction in discretion, and whether that is and in the case of the neighbourhood residential zone, the no-go zone, the discretion and opportunities are extraordinarily limited. So whether that's going to lead to better planning outcomes or worse planning outcomes in the long term is a matter for debate. I have a view, and I'm not sure what the others think, but I generally think that if you take away discretion, you don't end up generally with better results. Does that answer all the question, or? What about the second part?
Oh, again, what was the second part? You better refresh my memory, sorry.
It depends to a great extent upon the political leaders of the council in each area.
Yeah.
It's probably one for me. I was about to say I did want to disagree with Nick, just I think on principle. I do agree that there will be considerably less discretion once they're implemented. The way in which they're implemented actually probably is more discretionary or gives councils considerably more power over the way their suburbs develop, their municipalities develop than you would have seen up until now. I don't think there's any doubt that the political flavour and the political will of the councils is going to greatly influence precisely how they want to go about implementing these zones. You can probably pick from reading the newspapers which of the councils are going to become involved, which of the councils are going to seek to protect as much as they can in the no-go zones. That's why I say the panel hearings are going to be interesting. And it will be interesting to see what the dialogue between the councils and the minister's office are. If a council, for example, says it wants to put its entire residential area in a no-go zone. So there's no question that the political will of the council is going to make a big difference in this process.
Yes, Colin. Oh, we're just going to bring you a microphone so everyone can have the benefit of the question. Thanks, mate.
With all this potential new residential development, is there any indication, and probably this may well be going beyond the terms of this seminar, but is there any indication from this government as to improving infrastructure, and particularly railways, to serve places like Calcallo, where there's going to be a new city, effectively, north of Melbourne? And already there are signs up selling vacant land and paddocks with growing thistles and so forth. Is there any indication whatsoever from this government that there's going to be any improvement in transport, particularly when one finds, as I do, coming down from the country every now and then, that the volume of traffic on our roads is getting to a point where it's almost continual roadblock.
I think this is working. For the last 10 years that I've really focused on this area, I haven't seen any real impetus from government to spend more money on public transport. The current debate is about an east-west tunnel in Melbourne. Sometimes trains get on the radar, but really the focus is on roads, is on more roads, is on more cars on the roads. I think that's where the infrastructure money is going to be spent, if anywhere. It'll be on roads.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't see any indication that that's going to be a part of the rollout of the residential zones. But it's actually interesting when you think about what this is going to mean for how the metropolis as a whole develops, because as Sarah, I think, has indicated, so much is going to depend upon how the zones are implemented and to what areas they're allocated. Now, I think that it's realistic to expect that those leafy inner ring suburbs, the Stoningtons, the Baysides, the Boroondara, that have generally been resistant to increased development, are going to be seeking to impose the neighbourhood or no-go residential zone over as much of their municipality as they can. Conversely, I think you're going to find that it might be some of those newer or outer ring suburbs that are attracted to the residential growth zone as a means of attracting investment, increasing population, stimulating development. So what you are going to find is, I think, probably a shift away from this, what has been, I don't know, at least for 20, 30 years, a move towards urban consolidation and getting more people to live closer to the centre of activity, to a situation where there's higher and more development gradually extending further away. And those established services, those established suburbs with services, with better access to transport, are actually being encouraged to stop growing and stop developing at increased densities. And I can't ascertain any planning logic to that. One, I think, has to subscribe a political desire or a desire, rather than any sort of logical planning reason for it. But again, others may be able to put me right on that. I can't think for the life of me as to what the sensible planning logic is behind, in the neighbourhood residential zone, of introducing a mandatory restriction on subdivision so that you cannot have more than two units to a lot. Doesn't matter how big the lot is, it might be 2,000 square metres. You cannot have more than two houses on a lot. And you can even introduce a schedule to the zone that says it can be one. Now, why? Why do you need that? And how is that going to be good for a community? Why is stopping people from having smaller and more diverse housing, even in communities where you want to maintain neighbourhood character, how is that possibly a good thing? I'm struggling to work it out. But if anyone thinks they know why, please let us know. Right, we've got a question up the back, Brett, if I can.
This is a question from a non-planning person.
Yep.
What will this new regime mean, if anything, for the ugliness that is South Bank? We couldn't get rid of the gas and fuel buildings quick enough, and we've now replaced them. I hope there are no central equity people or representatives here, but we've replaced them with all those god-awful buildings, central equity buildings with red pipes on the outside that are appalling. Does it mean anything for that? And is there anything in the regime about building attractive buildings, or is it just about footprints on pieces of land and so on?
The answer to the first question is very simple. Absolutely nothing. There's nothing in this that will affect South Bank. All of that is in already within zones that are not going to be affected by that. You wouldn't expect to see these zones implemented there. South Bank is actually moving into the capital city zone. That has a wholly different planning regime. In terms of what it means for architecture, as is common with planning zones, it doesn't say much about whether you're going to get good architecture or bad architecture. There's always room for both. The state planning provisions that talk about having beautiful urban design in buildings will still be there, and there'll still be room for good and bad architecture under these zones as there is under others. I doubt it'll make any difference at all. That's all right. Except possibly you might get some really interesting architectural treatments that are intended to make sure it stays just within 13.5 metres.
I have a slightly different view on the second issue about what it's going to lead to in terms of whether buildings are attractive. It's been an ongoing debate, again, in planning circles as to whether attractive buildings are better promoted by giving people flexibility within which to work rather than have prescriptive building envelopes. And one of the problems with the central equity buildings that you spoke about is that they are buildings designed to meet a planning envelope so that they don't have to go through the process of being scrutinised. So they're easier to get permissions for if you build a, let's be neutral here, a dull building that just fills up the space, as opposed to a more interesting, or in some views attractive building that doesn't meet a height limit, that doesn't fill out the maximum envelope and stick to prescribed setbacks. But I think that, you know, telling people in a residential go zone or even in a neighbourhood residential zone that you can only have 2 or 4 stories just encourages people to build shorter, fatter buildings that go further out on the side, buildings that are designed to maximise that envelope rather than saying, look, I might have a 3-storey building but it only occupies 40% of the site area and around that I can have more garden area, things like that. So look, there are differences of view. Some people think that it's better to have clear direction and then there's no disputes about whether or not the building should be 13.5 metres or 14 metres. But I'm not myself convinced that that's going to mean that we end up with better looking suburbs. Can I perhaps just, before I leave you then, I just want to, for those of you who are planning practitioners and who may have the opportunity in the future to engage on a very detailed level with some of these controls, can I just identify a few things that you might want to think about as oddities again. One of the things that is snuck into all the zones is a new provision in each of them, which is headed no permit required, and it says that no permit is required to construct or carry out works normal to a dwelling. Now, I assume that is intended to mean that you no longer need a permit for rainwater tanks, solar panels, fences, pergolas, swimming pools, children's playgrounds, most of which, but not all of which, are covered within exemptions in the scheme as well. But it obviously leaves open some fertile ground for debate about whether what you are building is works normal to a dwelling. Home theatres, yes. Recording studios, yes. So the second part of it says that you also know, that goes to outbuildings. There's a second part of it which says construct or extend an outbuilding. So you don't need a permit to construct or extend an outbuilding other than a garage or a carport, provided it doesn't exceed 10 square metres and the building height is no more than 3 metres above ground level. But I can imagine that there'll be a lot of plans going into councils now with buildings, or not going into council, there will a lot of plans being prepared where the word garage or carport is being rubbed out and office space is being inserted instead, or second bedroom or garage, or not garage, or shed or something is being inserted in there. That's not a particularly significant matter, but it's an interesting little change. The other thing that's also, I think, very interesting is that in, for example, the general residential zone, where you've got now there's a specified maximum building height, and it says it's the building height in the schedule, but it goes on to say if no building height is specified, the requirement set out in the relevant standard of clause 55 or 54, so the requirement in res code applies. Now, what does that mean? Because it doesn't say the standard and the objective, it says the standard applies, and the standard is expressed in mandatory terms. So I think it's intended to be a discretionary control, but it's potentially not expressed to achieve that end. So there's another area for fertile debate. And the last thing that I wanted to observe is that one unusual aspect of the residential growth zone, so the go-go zone, is that it is now a decision requirement, so a decision guideline, sorry. So one of the things you have to think about when you put in an application is that for the construction of one dwelling on a lot, whether the development is an underutilisation of the lot. So in other words, if you wind up in a residential growth zone, or you own land in a residential growth zone, and all you want to do is build one dwelling, it's open for a decision maker to say, you can't have that. That's not enough. Now that's a concept that currently exists in planning but has fairly limited application. It's usually only applied in the context of major activity centres or those sort of areas. But now, potentially, and again, it depends on the extent of the residential growth zone, but if you are in land which is, for example, around an activity centre, and you own a single home and you want to knock it down and build another one, or you buy a lot and just want to build a house on it, you might find them saying, you can't do that. You're going to have to go and do a bit more. You're going to have to develop this for 4 stories. So that's an unusual, and that's a fairly significant change as well, and the extent to which that change is important will depend entirely upon how much of Melbourne is covered by the residential growth zone in the future. Well, I think we've come to the time when probably people have to go on and do their real work. We'd like to thank you very much for your attendance. I'd like to thank all the speakers for doing all the work and providing all the information, and we invite you again to stick around if you've got some more questions, or we'll see you again at the next time we have one of these. Thank you very much.